this Warmaster video we're going to look at the battlefield role of characters and flying units. In Warmaster, characters are split into three types: generals, wizards and heroes. In previous videos we've talked about the differences between character types and how they interact with units by issuing orders. As game pieces, characters are represented by one or more models on a single stand. And this gives you a lot of creative license, as you can create interesting dioramas or paint wonderful banners on your character's stands. The first and most important type of character is the general. Every army must have one general, no more, no less. Generally speaking, your general will have the highest command value in the army and also has the highest command range. He can issue orders to anywhere on the battlefield. Heroes are your subordinate commanders and will usually have a lesser command value compared to the general, and their command range is limited to 60 centimeters. Certain armies may allow you to field different types of hero with alternative titles, but functionally they are all the same. Wizards are also a subordinate commander. They have the smallest command range in the game with only 20 centimeters and usually have quite a low command value compared to other characters. However, they add a unique tactical advantage: the ability to cast magic spells. The Warmaster rules permit you to base your character pieces on standard 20x40mm Warmaster bases. And when calculating the command radius of the character, you're allowed to measure from any edge of that standard base. Therefore, placing a character on a standard Warmaster base allows you the greatest possible command range. However, the downside to using standard Warmaster bases to mount your characters is that in the heat of battle, they can be confused with unit stands. So many players prefer to mount their characters on round bases. And the rules allow you to substitute a standard Warmaster base for a round base up to 25mm in diameter. If you choose to place your characters on round bases, the rules permit you to measure the character's command radius from any edge of the round base, provided that base is no larger than 25mm. You may of course place characters on smaller than 25mm round bases, and many players do this to differentiate between character types. For example, I always place my wizards on 15mm round bases, and once again you measure the command range from any edge of the base. Equally, you may wish to place your characters on larger than standard size bases in order to make a diorama, or to accommodate a particularly large and fearsome mount. If you choose to do this, then you're not allowed to measure the character's command radius from the edge of the base. You must specify a single point on the base at the start of the game and tell your opponent, and from this point you measure all command distances. For example, this Dogs of War Paymaster measures his command range from the pile of gold in his wagon. Many characters can be mounted on ferocious monsters, and it's up to you as to whether you wish to place your monster mounted character on a standard base or put them on a slightly larger than standard base to accommodate the monster. Just remember, by placing them on a larger than standard base, you're actually reducing their command radius, as you must nominate a point on the base from which to measure their orders. In this picture, we have examples of characters that are mounted on standard bases and characters that are mounted on larger than standard bases. On the left hand side, all these characters are mounted on what are considered to be standard sized bases, which means you can measure their command range from the edge of their base. While on the right hand side, all these characters are mounted on larger than standard bases, which means you must nominate a point on their base from which they order their commands. In Warmaster, characters are treated differently from units. The character model is essentially a token from which the character's orders are measured. So this means the character model does not block line of sight and can be moved through freely by units from either side. In addition, character pieces cannot be targeted by enemy shooting attacks and cannot be engaged in combat by enemy units. Because character pieces don't count as units, their presence will not impose a -1 command penalty if they're within 20 centimeters of the enemy. and they're also ignored when the enemy works out who the closest target is for shooting attacks. or for initiative moves. Character pieces don't move in the same way as units. At the end of your command phase, after you've finished giving orders, any of your character pieces may be moved anywhere within 60 centimeters. This is an automatic move and doesn't require a command test to take place. This means that character pieces never move alongside their friendly units during the command phase. However, at the end of the command phase, there's nothing to stop you moving your characters to join a friendly unit that's within 60 centimeters. And we will discuss characters joining units in more detail later on. When moving your units, it is possible for a friendly unit to end up on top of a friendly character piece. When this happens, you simply displace your own character piece by the minimum distance required to allow you to place the unit in formation. However, if an enemy unit moves into contact with one of your character pieces, the character is removed as a casualty. Unless there is a friendly unit within 30 centimeters that the character can move into contact with. So this means you should always aim to keep your character pieces within 30 centimeters of their own units to prevent them being captured or killed by the enemy. Where a character piece is forced to join a friendly unit in this manner, then they will remain with that unit until the following command phase. And again, we'll discuss characters that have joined units in more detail later on. When a character moves, it treats all terrain as if it were infantry. So the only type of terrain that normally blocks a character's movement is terrain which is impassable to infantry. Now this will apply even if your character model is mounted on a horse or other riding animal. And this is because a lone character is far more able to negotiate terrain than a body of troops. However, most army lists permit you to mount your characters on monstrous or chariot mounts, and this will affect the way they move. Where a character in your army list is permitted to ride a chariot, this will clearly be added as an option in the army list itself. A typical chariot mount is an optional upgrade for a character costing 10 points and granting a bonus attack in combat. Some special chariot mounts may be slightly more expensive and grant an additional bonus, and this will be clearly stated in the army list entry. If you choose to mount a character on a chariot, then the character's movement is then restricted to only being able to pass through terrain that chariots can, which is effectively open ground, hills, bridges and built-up areas. A chariot mount also prevents the character from joining a unit which occupies terrain a chariot cannot enter. The second type of character mount available to most armies is the monstrous mount. A typical monstrous mount is another optional upgrade to a character costing anywhere from 15 to 100 points and adding a variable number of attacks in combat. Many monstrous mounts also cause terror and will grant this bonus to any unit the character joins in combat. By mounting a character on a monstrous mount, you prevent that character from entering any type of terrain which is impassable to monsters. And this also means the character cannot join a unit which is in terrain that monsters cannot enter. Some monstrous mounts, such as the Great Eagle, will permit any character riding them to fly. This increases their movement distance from 60 centimeters to 100 centimeters. A flying character can also ignore all terrain types as it moves, but can't end its move in terrain which is impassable to monsters, nor join a unit which occupies such terrain. Also note that a flying mount doesn't allow a character to move more than 30 centimeters if they're contacted by an enemy unit. Certain monstrous mounts, such as a dragon, will allow the character to make a shooting attack in the shooting phase, but note that a character may only do this if it has joined a unit, and we'll discuss this later on. Certain armies will also allow characters to be mounted on a special mount, which counts as neither a chariot nor a monster. In these rare cases, the special mount has no impact upon the character's ability to enter terrain. As we've already discussed, characters will join units in Warmaster in one of two ways. A character can either voluntarily join a unit at the end of the command phase by moving into contact with it, or a character may be forced to join a friendly unit that's within 30 centimeters if the character piece is contacted by an enemy unit when they move. In this example, the Araby hero character has decided to join the single stand of Araby knights fighting the birdmen. In addition, the Dogs of War character has also joined a unit of knights consisting of 2 stands. In both cases, the character piece is simply placed in contact with the unit it is joining. Once a character has joined a unit, it's considered to be part of that unit's formation. In effect, the character is now in the unit and doesn't actually physically occupy any space outside the unit. If other units come into contact with a unit containing a character, you can move the character piece around the unit to make way for them. If you can't physically place the character piece in contact with the unit it's joining, then you may either place the character piece on top of the unit, or put a suitable marker to indicate where the character is. And don't forget to remind your opponent which unit has been joined by the character. There is no limit to the number of characters that can join the same unit, but clearly only friendly characters can join friendly units. The main reason why characters are placed in units is so that the character can boost the unit when it engages in combat. Each character piece will have a number of attacks, and these attacks are added to any of the unit's stands when that unit makes its attacks in close combat. To do this, simply tell your opponent which one of the unit's stands will benefit from the character's attacks that round. Any attacks added by a character's mount are also added to the same stand. And if the character is mounted on a terror-causing monster, then the entire unit that has been joined by the character counts as causing terror for that round. And the bonus attacks plus any terror is usually enough to tip a combat in your favour. Now, even though any number of friendly characters can join one of your units, you're only permitted to add the attacks from one character to the combat. So it makes sense to choose the character with the highest number of attacks. Remember that characters are not units, so they don't benefit from any charge bonuses, which might otherwise apply to a unit they have joined. So the only attacks a character will ever add to a combat are its own attacks from its own profile, plus any attacks from its mount. The bonus attacks granted to units of chariots or monsters, for example, which charge enemies in the open, never apply to characters. Characters mounted on a monster which grants a shooting attack, such as a dragon, may employ this shooting attack in the shooting phase, provided the character has joined a unit. Simply add the character's shooting attacks to any stand from the shooting unit. And these type of shooting attacks can also be employed when a unit stands and shoots. And this means that if a unit's allowed to stand and shoot more than once in a turn, the character also shoots more than once. Now, the character with the highest number of attacks in your army is often the general, but players rarely mount their general on monsters or put them in combat. And this is because if the general is removed as a casualty, the game ends. Now, we've already discussed how if a character is caught by an enemy unit and there is no friendly unit within 30 centimeters that character can join, they are removed as a casualty. However, there is a second way in which characters can be killed. And that will happen if a character joins a unit and that unit is subsequently destroyed before the character has a chance to leave the unit again. Remember, characters can only move independently at the end of the command phase. And this means that if a character has decided to join a unit, then it can't leave that unit until the end of its next command phase. So a clever opponent will take every opportunity to destroy a unit containing a character before that character has a chance to leave it. A unit containing a character can be destroyed if it is forced to rout due to volume of enemy fire. It can be destroyed in close combat if the enemy removes all of the unit's hits. Or it can also be destroyed if it's forced to retreat from combat into impassable terrain or enemies. Once a character has joined a unit, then it's obliged to move with that unit for any movement that occurs outside of the command phase, such as drivebacks from shooting, or pursuits and advances in combat. Now, this can sometimes mean that the unit enters a terrain type which the character cannot enter if it's mounted on a monster or chariot. If all of a unit's stands enter terrain which is impassable to the attached character, then the character has to leave the unit and join another friendly unit within 30 centimeters, in the same manner as if the character had been contacted by enemy units. However, if at least one stand from the unit remains outside the impassable terrain, the character doesn't have to leave. If a character has joined a unit which is engaged in combat, then the character is not allowed to leave the unit whilst it remains in combat. And this means a character may end up stuck in a unit if the enemy keeps engaging it in combat over several turns. Characters do not move alongside units they have joined if the unit moves in the command phase. In effect, the unit will move away, leaving the character behind. And this applies whether the unit moves via orders or initiative. We have already discussed how characters issue orders during the command phase in a previous video. However, if a character fails an order by rolling a double 6, then something spectacularly bad has happened. This is called making a blunder. When a character makes a blunder, this counts as a failed order, and a roll must be made on the blunder table. This is a further d6 roll to determine how bad the blunder is. On the roll of a 1, the unit which was ordered suffers a permanent -1 command penalty for the rest of the battle. And if the blunder was rolled as part of a brigade order, then the blundering character chooses which of the units in the brigade suffers this penalty. On the roll of a 2 or 3, the unit or all units in a brigade will move no further provided there are no visible enemy units that are within the blundering unit or brigade's full pace move distance. If there are any visible enemy units within the blundering unit or brigade's full pace move distance, then they must move away from the closest visible enemy until they are at least a full pace move from them. On the roll of a 4 or 5, the blundering unit still gets to move, or all units in a blundering brigade. However, they can move no further than a half-paced move. While on the roll of a 6, the blundering unit must make a full-paced move towards the closest visible enemy unit, and must charge them if able to do so. If a whole brigade blunders in this way, then each unit is moved one at a time. Now let's move on to flying units. Flying units provide your Warmaster army with unique mobility options, as all flying units can move up to 100 centimeters each time they move, whether this be full pace or half pace. Flying units are allowed to use their initiative to charge the nearest visible enemy within 20 centimeters, just like ground units. However, flying units are never allowed to use their initiative to evade. Instead, they get a special homeback move. The homeback move occurs after all initiative moves have taken place, but before any orders are issued. It allows flying units to use their great mobility to move across the battlefield to receive orders from friendly characters, as flying units may only receive orders if they are within 20 centimeters of a character. To make a homeback move, roll a d6 for the flying unit that is homing back and multiply the result by 10 centimeters. This will give you a homeback range of between 10 and 60 centimeters. You can then choose to move your flying unit up to the maximum homeback distance rolled towards any one nominated friendly character in your army. However, this homeback move is entirely optional, and you can determine the distance before deciding whether to move at all. If you do decide to make a homeback move, nominate one friendly character and then move one stand from your flying unit directly into base contact with that nominated character, or as near as possible if the distance rolled is insufficient to reach the character or there is intervening terrain or units. You may then form up the remaining stands around the first stand moved. However, no stand may change its orientation as part of a homeback move. So this means that a unit of flyers which chooses to home back will always start its move and end its move facing the same direction. If the distance you rolled on the home back move is greater than the distance between the flying unit and the character they're homing back to, you cannot travel beyond the character. If the home back move is sufficient to bring the flying unit to within 20 centimeters of any character, then they are permitted to receive orders in that command phase. A flying unit is allowed to home back even if it is confused, although of course if they are confused they can't also receive orders that turn. When a flying unit moves, whether as a result of an order or by initiative or via a home back, then they can ignore any other units or terrain features that they pass over as part of their move. The only restriction is that flying units cannot end their move in any terrain which is impassable to infantry or in any type of wood. A flying unit cannot end its move on top of a friendly unit. And a flying unit may only end its move touching an enemy unit if it has declared a charge. Once a flying unit has ended its move, it is assumed to have landed on the ground once again, and therefore the line of sight of a flying unit is restricted to that of ground units. This means you're not allowed to declare charges if your flying unit can't see the enemy when it starts its move, even if it's permitted to fly over intervening units. There is nothing to stop you issuing more than one order to a flying unit in the same command phase, but remember, flying units can only be ordered by a character that's within 20 centimeters, and once a character starts ordering a flying unit, that same character must continue ordering it that command phase. In other words, you're not allowed to issue an order to a unit of flyers on one side of the battlefield, fly them to the other side of the battlefield, and order them again with a different character. Because flying units are assumed to have landed on the ground when they finish each of their moves, this means they can be engaged by the enemy, so flyers can be charged just as easily as any other units in your army. The additional mobility of flyers in combat is represented by the rule that only other flying units can normally pursue them. Note that flying units don't gain any special benefits if they attack units which are defended. For example, if flyers charge infantry units which are higher up a slope than the flyers, the infantry still get defended status. If you play siege games, then flying units are one of the few units which are allowed to charge against enemies in fortified positions on top of castle walls, although the enemy will still retain their fortified status against the flyers. A flying unit in combat which retreats or pursues must make this movement along the ground, as it is assumed that the flying unit is actually engaged in close combat with the enemy units who are on the ground. This means that when they do retreat or pursue in close combat, then flying units will be blocked by other unit stands or by impassable terrain. So a flying unit which is forced to retreat into impassable terrain or enemies or friends engaged in combat will be destroyed. And likewise, flying units cannot pursue enemies that retreat into woods or other types of terrain which is impassable to infantry. However, when making an advance move or a fallback move, then flying units are allowed to use their flying movement and therefore ignore intervening stands or terrain features, as when advancing or falling back, the flyers are not actually engaged in combat when they start their move. When a flying unit is driven back by enemy shooting, the flying unit may ignore intervening stands or terrain features as it is driven back. However, if the drive back move results in the flying unit ending its move on top of other units or inside impassable terrain, then the driven back flying unit is treated as having collided with either the other unit or the impassable terrain, and the standard rules for confusion will apply. So for example, if a flying unit is driven back by shooting and ends up on top of a friendly unit, the friendly unit may choose to make way. But if the drive back roll is sufficient to drive back the flying unit beyond the friendly unit, then the friendly unit doesn't have to make way, as the flyers are assumed to have swooped overhead during their drive back. If a flying unit is driven back into terrain it cannot enter, then it halts at the edge and rolls for confusion as normal. But again, if the drive back roll is sufficient to take the driven back flying unit beyond the impassable terrain, then it is assumed to have flown over the impassable terrain and no confusion roll is required. And finally, if a flying unit is driven back by enemy shooting and ends up on top of an enemy unit, then the flying unit will halt 1 centimeter away from the enemy unit and is automatically confused. But if the drive back roll is sufficient to take the driven back flying unit beyond the enemy unit, then it's not confused, as the flyers are assumed to have made it over the intervening enemy. This concludes my video on characters and flyers in Warmaster. And once again, if you find anything that you feel I've got wrong, please let me know in the comments below. In the next video we're going to take a look at the role that magic has to play in games of Warmaster, both the spells used by wizards and the magic items available to pick for your armies. I would also like to take a moment to dedicate this video to Gene C. Cochran, who sadly passed away in 2021. Gene was an avid collector and painter of Warmaster, and he was kind enough to allow me to use pictures of his work in many of my videos. Gene's talent will be greatly missed by the Warmaster community.